Okay. Good evening, thank you for coming tonight. The potato famine that swept Ireland in the mid-19th century was the most decisive event in the country's modern history, dramatically altering its economic and social structure. Before the famine, the population of Ireland was approximately 8 million, but by the turn of the century, the famine had caused enough starvation and emigration to reduce the population to just over 1 million. In her book, This Great Calamity, Dr. Christine Keneally reveals the diversity of the famine's impact from community to community and provides detailed accounts of relief measures organized at local and national levels. But most importantly, she explains that the occurrence of the famine was neither inevitable nor unavoidable. Now, please welcome Dr. Christine Keneally, a fellow at the University of Liverpool, who has also taught Irish history in Dublin and Belfast. She will discuss her recent books, This Great Calamity and A Death-Dealing Famine. Dr. Keneally.
Thank you. I'm not very tall, so can you hear me? Okay, if I adjust that. Thank you very much for inviting me here tonight, especially thank you to Nancy and Rita, who worked very hard on this. I grew up in England, although I have Irish background, and I grew up in a place called Liverpool. But today a taxi driver said to me, "Where is Liverpool?" And I assumed everybody had heard of it. It's in the north of England, and it's very important for Ireland because it was the main port of embarkation for Irish people who came to America. So if you have ancestors who came to America, chances are they came through Liverpool. The very poorest Irish immigrants stayed in Liverpool, and that's my ancestors. I'm just recovering from a throat infection, so I probably sound very croaky, and I think I sound a bit like John Lennon in drag, but again, I hope you can understand what I say. If I can just start off by a few comments of why I think the Irish famine is important and why 150 years later we should remember it. I think, firstly, it is the question of memory. Just as a person really isn't a person without a memory, I think a country isn't a country without a memory of its past. Without that, we have no present, we have no future. Secondly, the scale of the tragedy means it deserves to be remembered. Even by modern standards of famine, even compared to Rwanda, Somalia, Bangladesh, the Irish famine was the most lethal famine in modern world history. 1 million people died, 1 million people emigrated. In the space of 6 years, Ireland lost 25% of her population. Moreover, Ireland never recovered. Even after the famine, the population of Ireland continued to fall. And by 1900, it had fallen to 4 million people, half of its pre-famine level. And even today, Ireland is the only country in Europe with a population now smaller than the one it had in 1841. So evidence of the famine is still there today. Thirdly, the Irish famine was a watershed. It changed the political, social, economic and cultural development of Ireland. Ireland was never the same again. Also, it changed other countries. The development of modern America owes much to those Irish immigrants. And lastly, why I think we should remember the famine is because famine is disgusting. There is no glory, honour or dignity in dying of famine or famine-related diseases. Dying from starvation is slow, painful and obscene. And I want you to remember that tonight. Also, what strikes me about the famine, there are still famines occurring in the world today. And as in the Irish famine, they are not just about food shortages, they are about political choices and decisions. And tonight I really want to look at the political choices that were made by the British government. And the role of the British government is important because, as you probably know, in 1800 there was an Act of Union. And as a result of this Act of Union, Ireland lost her parliament and became instead part of the United Kingdom. And during the famine, all decisions for Ireland came from this parliament in London. So there was a geographic distance as well, I believe, as a cultural and ideological difference. But if I can start off with the famine and go back to the very basic, the potato. Before the famine, 2/3 of the Irish population depended on potatoes for subsistence. Although the diet was monotonous, it was highly nutritious. And Irish people, before the famine, were the healthiest, the tallest, and the most fertile population in Europe. It's very different from modern famines, which mostly occur on people who are already malnourished. So Irish people were very tall and very healthy. But there was a high level of dependence on the potato. But even though the potatoes were so important in the Irish economy, Ireland grew many other items of food, especially corn. But most of the corn that was grown in Ireland was grown for export. And on the eve of the famine, Ireland was exporting enough corn to Britain to feed 2 million people each year. Ireland was also exporting cattle. Approximately 250,000 cattle were exported from Ireland to Britain every year. And I say that because, again, I think it's important to realise that before the famine, Ireland was not only growing enough food for its own large population, it was producing an agricultural surplus. But most of that food was going to Britain. Potatoes, however, were looked down on. People who ate potatoes were regarded as being lazy. Diet was used as a cultural benchmark. And the very common saying in Ireland was that Irish people were a lazy people who ate a lazy crop grown on lazy beds. And even before the famine, many members of the British government wanted to change Ireland. They wanted Irish agriculture to modernise. And they felt that this could not happen as long as people ate potatoes and subsisted on small plots of land. So there was an idea, how can we change Ireland even before the famine? The famine commenced when blight appeared, a mysterious blight appeared in the country in August 1845. Now, this blight had already appeared in America. In fact, we think it came in from America in 1844. From America, it came to Belgium, and from Belgium, it spread to France, Spain, Germany, England, and then over to Ireland. But it was only in Ireland that so many people ate potatoes. The government realised that the consequences of this loss could be serious, and they decided to do two things. One is the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, appointed a scientific commission because he wanted to know, A, what caused the blight, and B, how many of the potatoes had been lost. And the scientific commission was dominated by English scientists. And he felt this was important on the grounds that, and this is a quote, anything that comes out of Ireland is surrounded by a haze of exaggeration. So he wanted to send Englishmen to Ireland. The scientists got it wrong. They in fact overestimated the extent of loss. They said over 50% of the crop had been lost. It was about 40%, although that worked to Ireland's advantage. The second thing that Sir Robert Peel did was he put in place a package of relief measures, and these were very successful. And his main relief measure was he brought Indian corn from America to Ireland. Now, Indian corn is the very hard yellow maize. It's not very tasty, it's not very nutritious. But it was felt that if Irish people could get a taste for Indian corn, they might stop eating potatoes. In 1845-46, nobody died of famine. The government's policies were very successful. The government also hoped that this blight had ended the dependence of Irish people on the potatoes. There were many myths about potatoes in Britain. One was that they were an aphrodisiac, and that's why there were so many people in Ireland. I don't think it's true. Another was that it only took 12 weeks of the year to grow potatoes, so Irish people had 40 weeks to sit around, smoking, having children, plotting rebellion, drinking, of course, all the usual stereotypes. So the British government was very hopeful that perhaps the blight would end this dependence on the potato. Queen Victoria, in the state opening of Parliament in 1846, said, this potato blight is good because potatoes have been, quote, a fruitful source of crime and misery. So again, potatoes were associated with all sorts, literally those sins being the root of all evil. In 1846, the potato blight returned to Ireland. And I said in 1845, about 40% of the crop had been destroyed. But in 1846, the destruction was much more complete. Over 90% of the potato crop had been destroyed. So the situation was potentially more serious. In that summer, there'd been a change of government. Sir Robert Peel had fallen from power, and he was replaced by Lord John Russell, and his government remained in place for the remainder of the famine. Now, they were very anxious not to continue the policies of the previous year. They felt that the relief given in 1845-46 had been too generous and was creating what they called a culture of dependency. So they wanted to cut back in the second year of shortages. And they did this in a number of ways. Firstly, they decided not to bring food into Ireland. Not to. They said, we'll leave it to free market forces. Yes. Secondly, they decided that the main form of relief was to be public works. Now, if any of you've been to the west of Ireland, you'll see the result of those public works. They're called famine roads. They're roads that begin nowhere and lead nowhere. For the most part, they were useless. Their main purpose was to act as a test of destitution. If people wanted any form of relief, they had to perform this hard physical labour. As a system of providing relief, it was very cruel. People were expected to perform 12 hours of labour a day. Initially, they were only intended for men, but because wages paid on them were so low, in the winter of 1846-47, women and children flocked onto them. The demand was so great that they could never keep up with that demand. And there are many stories in Irish folklore of people standing by the side of the roads, waiting for somebody to die so they could take their place. Also, because the government wanted to impose various bureaucratic controls, the public works took 2 months to set up. So, as a means of providing emergency relief, they weren't very successful. And it's in the winter of 1846 that the famine really commences. It's in this winter that disease, death, eviction, emigration really start to spiral. We don't know precisely how many people died in that winter, but the local Irish police estimated that in those winter months alone, 500,000 people died. It's at this period that the name of Skibbereen, a small town in West Cork, became very notorious. There was so much suffering and mortality in the town, and it attracted the attention of national press and then international press, and people came to see what was happening in Skibbereen. But it wasn't just in the west of Ireland. The suffering was all over in many parts of Ireland. And if I can just read a report from County Sligo, I don't know if any of you know it, it's just below Donegal. And I think this will convey some of the horror of the famine. It's from the Belfast Vindicator. And it talks about 15 people being found dead, and the verdict is they've all died from starvation. And then he goes to say, horrible, an inquest was held on the 12th of the month upon the body of Thomas McManus of Kilmactranny. Verdict, deceased came to his death by hunger and cold. The wretched creature was observed by a man lying in a muddy ditch. He was raised up, and the man went to 2 or 3 houses in the neighbourhood and asked the people to admit the deceased, but they refused, alleging he had typhus fever. He then carried deceased to a haggard and placed him on some straw, where we found him dead on the following morning and dreadfully mutilated. We copy the evidence of Thomas Burrows, MD, quote, examine the body of Thomas McManus. Both the legs, as far as the buttocks, appeared to have been eaten off by a pig. Is of opinion the death was caused by hunger and cold. There was not a particle of food found in the deceased's stomachs or intestines. Those who saw the body were of opinion, from the agonised expression of McManus's countenance, that he was alive when the pig attacked him. And I think that just sums up some of the horror of famine. And that is, unfortunately, not a unique example. There are many other stories of people being eaten by rats or dogs, and some stories of cannibalism. The famine was truly awful. Another aspect of the government's relief policies in that winter was they decided not to close the ports, but to allow other food grown in Ireland to leave. Now, many people, including the nationalist Daniel O'Connell, asked the government to close the ports, but they refused to do so. And so, as people starved in Ireland, vast amounts of food continued to leave the country. I've recently started some research on this area myself, and I cannot believe the quantities of food. The period 1846 to 1850, 3 million cattle were exported from Ireland. So more animals than people left Ireland during the famine. In 9 months to Liverpool, 874,000 gallons of porter, which is a type of Guinness, were exported. 183,000 gallons of whiskey left Ireland. And of course that is made from corn. Vast amounts of food left Ireland. I've even come across examples of potatoes being exported from Ireland in that winter, and some Indian corn, which had been brought into Ireland to feed the people, yet it was being exported. A report in an American newspaper I read quite recently said we have got more food from Ireland this year than in any previous season. So it shows very clearly that there was a dual economy within Ireland. While people starved, large amounts of food were leaving the country. And it's an area that is quite controversial. The failure of the public works resulted in another change of policy by the British government, and in the spring of 1847 they introduced soup kitchens to Ireland. Now, as the name suggests, as you probably understand, soup kitchens were where people could go and get free food. And the important thing is that for the first time since 1845, the British government was tackling the problem of hunger directly. People were able to get what they needed most, which was food. The scheme was set up throughout Ireland. In some parts of the country, such as Westport and County Mayo, 100% of the population depended on soup for daily existence. And in those summer months of 1847, mortality did go down. At its height, over 3 million people every day were getting free rations of food from the soup kitchens. But to me, what it shows very clearly is that the British government had the logistic and the administrative ability to feed the people of Ireland. They only did so for 3 months. They chose not to do it for any longer. Unfortunately, the soup kitchens were a temporary measure, because after the autumn of 1847, the government decided that they would give no more assistance to Ireland, but that if Ireland needed any more relief to be given, it had to be paid for by Irish taxpayers. And the method of doing this was through the Irish Poor Law, the Irish workhouse system. Also in the autumn of 1847, there's a change of policy. It's very evident within British circles. One member of the government declared that the Irish famine was over, and that was the justification for no more relief. But also in Britain, people were fed up with what they saw as giving money to Ireland. And the Times newspaper, which marshalled a very effective campaign against Ireland, described the previous 2 years in Ireland as being, quote, a great blessing, because of the changes it had brought about. It recommended that no more money should be given to Ireland, because to do so would, quote, be ineffectual as to throw a sack of gold into one of their plentiful bogs, unquote. The Prime Minister felt that his policies had lost him a lot of support in England, and he said, quote, we have, in the opinion of Great Britain, done too much for Ireland, and he felt that it was necessary for financial retrenchment to take place. The Lord Lieutenant in Ireland said, what are we to do with this country? And this is a quote from a letter. He says, quote, Eskimos and New Zealanders are more thrifty and industrious than these Irish people, who deserve to be left to their fate, instead of the hard-working people of England being taxed for their support. But can we do so? We shall equally be blamed for keeping them alive or letting them die, and have only to select between the censure of the economists or the philanthropists. Which do you prefer, unquote. The government realised that its new relief policies would cause some hardship, but they justified it because, again, they felt they were bringing about a great social revolution in Ireland, and this would benefit Ireland ultimately. Charles Wood, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, justified the new policy on the grounds that, quote, except through a purgatory of misery and starvation, I cannot see how Ireland is to emerge into anything approaching peace or prosperity, unquote. In 1847 also, a new stringent policy was introduced, the Gregory Clause or Quarter Acre Clause. And this said that no person who occupied more than a quarter of an acre of land could get relief. quarter of an acre of land is very small and is not enough to keep a family together. And what this policy meant was that people had to make a choice between holding onto their land or getting relief. Obviously, people gave up their land as a result. Also, because taxes in Ireland became so high and rents weren't being paid, many landlords started a policy of wholesale eviction. We don't know precisely how many people were evicted, but between 1846 and 1852, we think 500,000 people were legally evicted from their holdings. So again, there was a massive social revolution going on in Ireland. But as a result of these evictions, after 1847, homelessness became as much of a problem in Ireland as hunger. In 1848, despite these new stringent relief commissions, 1.5 million people were still in receipt of poor relief. And what this shows very clearly is that the Irish famine was not over. It did not end in 1847. The blight came back in 1848 and was as bad as in 1846. And in 1849, there was a new peak of mortality. And in the west of the country, more people died in 1849 than had died in Black 47. So what does the British government decide to do? They send Queen Victoria to Ireland. And Queen Victoria had never visited Ireland. She was very reluctant to go. Her visit was brief, carefully stage-managed and confined to the east of the country, which was beginning to recover. Also, she never travelled overland. She only travelled by boat in the country. She declared herself to be delighted with her Irish subjects, and she wrote a letter to her uncle, the King of Belgium, saying, quote, "My dearest uncle, everything here has gone beautifully since we arrived. The whole harbour and every surrounding place was covered with thousands and thousands of people who received us with the greatest enthusiasm. The women here are really handsome, even in the lowest class. Such beautiful black eyes and hair and such fine teeth," unquote. At one point she did note that the people of Ireland were dressed in rags, and she explained it on the grounds that the women never mend anything. I've recently come across, there was apparently an attempt by the Young Islanders, a nationalist movement, to abduct her, but they didn't succeed. And also I've recently come across a ditty that was sung on the streets when Queen Victoria was in Ireland, saying, "Arise ye dead of Skibbereen and come to Cork to see the Queen." At the same time that Victoria was visiting the east of the island, a relief commissioner in Kilrush in County Clare in the west of Ireland sent an impassioned plea to his superiors in London. And I've mentioned Skibbereen, which is very well known for its suffering, but I think of all the areas, County Clare probably suffered most during the famine. He wrote, quote, "The condition of the poor becomes daily worse and the mortality more distressing. As soon as one crowd of houseless and naked paupers are dead or provided for in the workhouse, another wholesale eviction doubles the number, who in turn pass through the same ordeal of wandering from house to house or burrowing in the bogs or behind ditches, until, broken down by privation and exposure to the elements, they seek the workhouse or die by the roadside," unquote. In 1849 also, the relief policies of the government received a blow when Edward Twistleton, the chief commissioner in Ireland, resigned on the grounds he could no longer implement the policies of the British government, quote, "with honour." And to me this is very significant, because this is an Englishman who has been appointed by the British government to put in practice relief policies, and there is an increasing divergence. He no longer feels he can do it. The Lord Lieutenant in Ireland sympathised with Twistleton's resignation, writing to the Prime Minister, quote, "The destitution here is so horrible, and the indifference of the House of Commons to it so manifest, that Twistleton is an unfit agent of a policy that must be one of extermination," unquote. Again, an Englishman saying that. Before disappearing from public life, Twistleton delivered an impassioned critique of the actions of the British government before a parliamentary committee. He said, quote, "I wish to remark that it is wholly unnecessary that there should be a single death from starvation this year in Ireland. For a comparatively trifling sum, it is possible for this country to spare itself the deep disgrace of permitting any of our fellow subjects to die of starvation. I wish to leave distinctly on record that from want of sufficient food, many persons are at present dying or wasting away. And at the same time, it is quite possible for this country to prevent the occurrence there of any death from starvation by the advance of a few £100, unquote. The continuation of high levels of mortality in 1849, especially in County Clare, resulted in the appointment of a parliamentary committee of inquiry. Again, Englishmen being sent to Ireland to find out what was going on. The committee was critical of many aspects of government relief, especially the role played by local landlords and the policies of the central government. Their report concluded, quote, "A neglect of public duty has occurred and has occasioned a state of things disgraceful to a civilized age and country, for which some authority ought to be held responsible and would long since have been held responsible had these things occurred in any part of England," unquote. In 1850, blight again appeared in parts of Ireland, especially in counties Clare, Kerry and Tipperary. The government responded by introducing a new tax on the ratepayers of Ireland. It was not until 1852 that blight disappeared from Ireland. But although in this limited sense the famine could be said to be over, mortality, pauperism, evictions and emigration were all far higher than their pre-famine levels. And just in conclusion, as the committee acknowledged, the Irish famine clearly demonstrated that the Act of Union of 1800, despite the Act of Union of 1800, the relationship between England and Ireland remained unequal. The famine occurred on the doorstep and within the jurisdiction of the richest and most powerful empire in the world. Despite this, 1 million people died in the most lethal famine in modern history. But apart from the decimation of the Irish population, the famine also destroyed the cultural and, I believe, the spiritual basis of Irish society. And if I can just conclude with a quote which I think conveys this sense of loss. It's from a woman in the Rosses in County Donegal, and she's remembering the famine. The original is in Irish, but this is a translation. And she said, quote, "The years of the famine, of the bad life and the hunger arrived and broke the spirit and strength of the community. People simply wanted to survive. Their spirit of comradeship was lost. It didn't matter what ties or relations you had. You considered that person to be your friend, who gave you food to put in your mouth. Recreation and leisure ceased. Poetry, music and dancing died. These things were lost and completely forgotten. When life improved in other ways, these pursuits never returned as they had been. The famine killed everything." Thank you very much.
Dr. Keeler's books are on sale on this table, and she'll be autographing at the table toward the back in front of the music section.
Are there any questions? Yeah, are there any questions?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You started off by saying how, as many historians do, how not knowing the past doesn't take you far into the future. Do you think that knowing the majority of Irish people now are totally aware of the past, and if so, how is that translating into the consciousness of the present, and do you think the future?
Yeah, I don't think many Irish people are really aware of the past, especially in regard to the famine, because one of the remarkable things about the famine is that even though it was such a pivotal event in the development of modern Ireland, there's been a great silence about the famine. And in fact, in the last 2 years, more books have been written about the famine than were written in the previous 150 years. And there's one doctor, and his theory is that Ireland, firstly, it was traumatised, but secondly, the whole psychological impact of the famine has never really been fully understood. But it's taken many, many years for Irish people to be ready to look back at the famine and you try and understand what happened. I think there was a denial, especially in the immediate post-famine period, because I think the country was traumatised. People had gone through such an awful amount of suffering. And for those people who survived, I think there was an element of guilt, because they say, well, why did we survive? Could we have done more? So it was very hard to come to terms with. So I think it's only now that perhaps you Irish people, both in Ireland and elsewhere, are ready to face the famine again.
And how do you see that working itself out?
Well,
Politically?
I don't know how it will work out politically, but certainly I think it's very good as a healing process, because I think it's a wound that's never really healed. And I think by addressing it and acknowledging what happened on all sides, I think it is part of a healing process.
Does the church have a role in that, do you think?
In the famine or in the healing process?
In the healing process.
Certainly some individuals are very, I know in my own town of Liverpool, some individuals are very outspoken and very positive and do welcome the discussion about the famine now. So yes, I think it does have.
This still happens nowadays, that they would export food and leave the people starving in South American countries. Is that not so?
That's true. I think that's one of the most stark parallels, that famine, it's rarely just an ecological disaster. There's a very much a human dimension to it. And I know Somalia, Rwanda, large amounts of food were exported from there. And certainly during the famine, that's the case. The Lord Lieutenant in 1848, he said, the country is very quiet and the troops have nothing to do except guard the provisions of food being exported. So, yeah, I think that's a very strong parallel.
Could you say something more about immigration? How what immigration occurred was financed, why there wasn't more, where people went? You mentioned the west of England. We certainly know about the United States, but there must have been a lot of other areas as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. Immigration, we think at least 1 million people emigrated by 1851, but then in the period up to 1855, another 1 million people emigrated. So in the space of 10 years, 2 million people left Ireland, an incredible amount. What's also incredible is that most of that emigration was personally financed. The very poorest people just died. People with a bit more resources, financial and health resources, tended to emigrate. Most of the emigration was to America. That was the chosen place, but quite a large number did go to Britain, and when they went to Britain they settled in places like Manchester and England. And just I was talking about the Act of Union not really being honoured, because there was legislation in England so that Irish people could be deported back to Ireland, the law of settlement, which seems crazy in the context of the Act of Union, but that happened. Emigration in many ways was a safety valve. Over 90% of the people who emigrated did survive. But the conditions on the ship, I mean, leaving Ireland was not the end of the tragedy, because the conditions on the ship were awful. Emigration was not regulated in any way. And then once they got to the new countries, they were often, there was a hostile reception. Also because many of these people were broken down. It's estimated that emigrants who came to America, once they arrived, their average lifespan was 6 to 12 years. So even if they got to America, they didn't live that long. The first generation of emigrants were generally very poor. It was the second generation which were much more successful. Some landlords financed emigration about 5%, and those who got landlord assistance were generally more comfortably off. Some nationalists would say, well, that was just a way of ridding the land of the people, but it was certainly a way out of the country. Some Irish people went to Australia. There was a scheme after 1848 to send Irish orphan girls to Australia, on the grounds that Australia, there were 9 men to every 1 woman in Australia at the time, and the Australian government felt that they needed the civilising influence of women. So the British government, who wasn't having to pay, said, this is great, we have a lot of women in Irish workhouses, we'll help, we'll send you women. And it's one of the schemes I like in a way, because one of the government ministers, a civil servant, intervened, and he said, let's send Protestant girls from the north of Ireland to Australia first, because they're hard-working, they're morally superior, and they'll make a good impression. So the first boatload of women that went to Australia were sure enough from Belfast, but it turned out many of them were former prostitutes, and they had a wild time on the boat. 2 of them became pregnant. Some of them tried to murder the ship's captain by putting ground glass in his food, which apparently is very good way of murdering anybody. They didn't succeed. And then they got there and there was all sort of outrage against these women. But what finally brought the scheme to an end was that it was found that these Irish women were no good at housework. So the Australian men didn't want them. So the scheme came to an end. But that's one of the few times where the government involved itself in the process of emigration. Again, it left emigration to free market forces.
I'd like to admit that I know nothing about current Ireland at all or agriculture at all, but we do have new strains of potato light blight going through our country now. It's starting to decimate our potato crop. Does Ireland still rely on potatoes as the main crop, or are they much more diversified now?
No, not at all. But one of the, I don't know, strange features is that Ireland still has the highest potato consumption in the world. So Irish people still love their potatoes. Did I tell you how many potatoes they ate before the famine? No, because people say they can't believe it. But before the famine, potato consumption was very high, and an average man would have eaten 14 pounds of potatoes every day, which is 70, I know, people can't believe it, 70 potatoes, and a woman would have eaten about 55 potatoes, and that's why they ate them in such large number. That's why they got so much nutrition. They ate them with their skins on, so it was very, very healthy, but a bulky diet. So when the famine came and they were given a small amount of Indian corn, their stomachs weren't used to this, and also Indian corn had no nutrition. But even after the famine, Irish people returned to eating potatoes. They really seemed to enjoy it. But no, potatoes aren't grown. But your question about the blight, an antidote to the blight was found in the 1880s, but the blight is still there. Potato crops still have to be sprayed for that blight. It still exists. But during the famine, there was no antidote found for the blight.
Famine studies is, I understand, required reading now for elementary schools in the city of New York. Do you ever see that as becoming a reality for all of the United Kingdom or in England?
No. This gentleman has referred to the fact that in New York there's some legislation now which says that the famine should be part of, I think it's human rights, I'm not quite sure, but part of the curriculum, so that school children in New York should learn about the Irish famine. In Ireland, in fact, it hasn't been, the famine has not been on the curriculum, the school curriculum, for over 30 years. So generations of people in Ireland have grown up not knowing much about the famine. And in England, Irish history, it's maybe taught at university level, but very little in school level, very, very little. I grew up in England. I didn't study any Irish history at all, although I desperately wanted to. It's only very slowly changing. So I think what's happening in New York is very good. In fact, it's ironic because children in New York will know more about the famine than perhaps children in Ireland, unless the curriculum changes.
So you wrote a thesis on? No, agriculture, totally different. Yeah. Hi. Just off, okay. I work in agriculture at a university, and we have a whole bunch of potato blight coming back again now. And we don't, it's a major crop, and we don't rely on it solely. That's why I asked about the diversity of cropping over there, and I don't know how diverse cropping is, agriculture is. Never been there, but...
The antidote for the potato blight is copper sulfate.
Yeah.
That's what they discovered
It's
as the
resistant.
solution.
It doesn't work now.
It doesn't work anymore?
We've got new strains, new varieties of late blight disease organisms. Nothing's working right now on that.
Oh, that's scary, isn't it?
It's scary, yeah.
Yeah, there were some reports that the blight affected the turnip crop as well in Ireland in 1846, which I only come across one reference to that. So...
But
I don't know if that's the same. Do you think it could?
Yeah, same disease. Yeah,
it's the same. Okay.
Same organism. There's different strains of it.
Yeah.
It's mutated and it's affecting the crops again now.
Right. Scary. Yeah. History repeats itself.
Yeah.
So you're
Larry.
L-A-R-R-Y.
R-Y.
Okay. And this is a fungus or just...
Yes, it's a fungus. It's a disease. Yep.
Yeah,
same,
the same.
Same one. Yep.
And carried by sort of warm, damp. This one
has
was...
to be warm, has to be damp,
Yeah,
has to be wet.
oh, it's exactly the same.
And
And,
so we get-
of course in Ireland.
And we get some warm conditions, warm summers, and it's coming back again now. If it's a very dry summer, and it may be what happened.
That happened in Europe, so it didn't go back to Europe after the first year, but not in Ireland.
Yeah.
Okay. All right,
Good,
thank you very much.
yeah.
Thank you.
Hi.
Young man.
Zebby would like one answer, please.
So, okay. So, you tell me how to spell your name, because I won't spell it wrong.
Z-E-B.
Just Zeb?
Yeah.
That's all you want?
Yeah.
Do you want me to put the Irish for famine on it? Do you know what the Irish for famine is? That's
Can you say that? Encore.
it means the great hunger.
Now, is your daughter interested in history?
Yeah.
Is she growing up with the same interests? That's great.
Yeah, she is. Yeah.
I'm very curious about your pamphlet that was withdrawn on a band in England. What's the subject?
Remembering the famine, how it's been commemorated.
Just a general.
It was just I
Coverage?
was asked just to write an article on how the famine had been commemorated, and I called it a dangerous memory because the famine has been so politicised, and should we remember? And of course I think we should. And the British government seemed to think it is a dangerous memory, so they tried to have it stopped.
Now, this one's for Rita Mullen.
Okay. And is Rita's surname with an A?
I think it's I-N. M-U-L-L-I-N. So if it's wrong, it's all my fault. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Rita, R-I-T-A, Mullen. So will you shop your pamphlet for a publisher in this country?
I wouldn't mind, yeah. To try to, yeah.
And then just a general signature on this one so that I can have it to give to someone. I don't know yet who,
Okay.
but since you gave me one, now I'll have one to give away. And Zebby will have one too, so. Great, thank you very much.
These two sign.
Yeah, sure.
One's to my dad. His name's Andy.
A-N-D-Y.
Yeah, A-N-D-Y. I guess can you just write Happy St. Patrick's Day to a great dad or something like that?
On this one?
Yeah.
Great, okay. My father's Andy as well.
He was actually born and raised in County Kerry.
Oh, yeah, Carrie, so I love Carrie. The Tipperary. Have you been back to Kerry?
Oh yeah, all my aunts and uncles and cousins still live there.
Which part of Tipperary? I mean Kerry.
Kerry, they live in Hartford.
Oh, yeah. Me too, yeah. Tralee, I know very well.
Yeah.
Castle Gregory.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we go there most years. Like,
This is for myself. And my name's Borneen.
okay, just
B-O-U-R-N-E-E-N.
B-O-U-R-N-E-E-N. It's very unusual.
It means my darling or my sweetheart in Gaelic.
Yeah, it's lovely. I'll just have to check.